fun fact for you. Did you know that until just recently, more people had been to the moon than to the deepest parts of our own ocean? By divine or alien intervention, you were kept alive. You would then freeze.
And so, it's not a shocker that the bottom of the world is just an endless void, devoid of life, right? Well, surprise, surprise, it's not. Because down there, in the deepest, coldest parts of the ocean, something strange happens, which, to quote Ian Malcolm,
one of the oddest things that happens is that not only does life survive, but it also gets big, really big. In a place where pressure alone can kill you, you'll find creatures that are upscaled, stretched, and seemingly mutated. You have shrimps the size of cats, bug-like creatures that look like tanks, and animals with eyes the size of dinner plates, just to name a few. And the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Most people think of the ocean as being one pretty much uniform entity. But in reality, the ocean is actually separated into 5 distinct layers, each with its own ecological rules, so to speak.
And the deeper you go, the more alien it gets, despite being, in fact, technically closer to Earth.
The first 200 meters is the epipelagic zone, more commonly known as the sunlight zone. And this is the ocean. And together, it's home to about 90% of all marine life, despite representing just 3% of the ocean's total volume. But once you cross that 200-meter, or 656 feet threshold, well, you've left familiar territory behind.
It gets colder, the light fades, and everything looks a bit different.
But congrats, you've now hit the mesopelagic zone, or the twilight zone. This area extends to 1,000 meters, or 3,280 feet. But funny enough, despite sunlight, bioluminescence. In other words, light from living organisms. It's also here that one of nature's most remarkable phenomena occurs. The daily vertical migration of billions, and then retreat back to the depths at dawn, creating what scientists refer to as the deep scattering layer.
Which, by the way, is so dense that it was initially mistaken for seafloor by early sonar operators.
And then after this zone comes the bathypelagic zone, i.e. the midnight zone.
Here, the temperature drops to 4 degrees Celsius or 39 degrees Fahrenheit, while the pressure rises to 400 atmospheres.
And would be like having an SUV on every square inch of your body. As not even a strand of sunlight makes it down here, with the only photons in sight coming from the increasingly bizarre life which calls the depths their home.
And now that we're down to 4,000 meters, or 13,000 feet, you may be thinking that this is surely the bottom.
This area, despite being extraordinarily deep, actually encompasses the vast majority of the ocean floor.
And with this depth, food is scarce to say the least, with it deriving primarily as what scientists like to call marine snow.
And the abyss itself extends to 6,000 meters, or 19,600 feet.
And then, we reach the true bottom of the ocean, the Hadal Zone, literally named after Hades himself.
Encompassing everything past the 6,000 meter, or 19,600 feet divide.
The Mariana Trench, Tonga Trench, Kuril-Kamchatka Trench, to name a few, are the deepest areas in the entire world.
Plunging to nearly 11 kilometers or 6.8 miles beneath the surface, which, just to put that into perspective, is deeper than Mount Everest is tall.
And at the very bottom of the Mariana Trench is the king of them all, the Challenger Deep, which sits right at that maximum depth.
Where the pressure is more than 1,000 atmospheres, or over 14,000 pounds per square inch.
In other words, equivalent to the weight of an entire skyscraper pressing down into a single human-sized area.
And while we do know how quickly we'd be crushed down here, or how cold it is, we honestly don't know much relative to how interesting this place is.
And that's because we've barely seen it. Most of our knowledge of the deep comes from unmanned trips down here,
with the very first one being the Trieste in 1960.
And let's just say that was both terrifying and not very illuminating. No pun intended. It pretty much consisted of a steel barrel.
Swiss oceanographer Jacques Piccard and U.S. Naval Lieutenant Don Walsh.
On their way down, one of their windows shattered due to the immense pressure, but they did manage to make their way to the bottom.
Staying there for 20 minutes, while all the while reporting sounds of creaking and strain from the vessel.
And then, back up they went. So honestly, kind of uneventful, but scary.
The technical challenges were simply too daunting, too high.
In fact, it was only in 2012 that James Cameron made a solo dive down there in the Deep Sea Challenger.
The bottom is alien, featureless, and impossibly quiet, almost like a barren, desolate lunar plain.
However, since then, there have been a lot more notable crewed dives and vessels. But to be honest, most deep sea exploration today,
like Japan's Kaiko, France's Victor 6000,
or the Nereus, which actually imploded under pressure in 2014 while exploring the Kermadec Trench.
Just goes to serve as a reminder of how hostile conditions are in the deep ocean. And honestly, even exploring the ocean at lesser depths is a huge challenge as well.
But the most significant challenge to exploring the deeper areas of the planet isn't even the environment or technology.
and despite it representing a huge portion of the ocean, we've actually seen very little of it. Yet what we have seen has only defied our expectations, and that very much includes life itself, containing some of the oddest life forms we know about.
And one unusual trend found in life down there is despite the crushing pressure and seemingly lack of food.
Imagine you were suddenly shoved into a submarine that was hopefully not made by a billionaire, and then tossed right down to the 700-meter mark.
If you look out your little window, the familiar blue has long since faded to black. The only light you're seeing...
The pressure has already exceeded 70 atmospheres, which would kind of be like having a school bus parked in your chest. And the great news is, you've barely begun your descent. But then, suddenly out of nowhere,
say hello to Praia Dubia, our first deep-sea giant. And I say giant singular, but it may be more accurate to the plural version.
You see, what Praia Dubia really is a colony of clones called zooids, which are linked together to...
And similar to how we have specialized body parts to do different things, like our mouth to eat with and lungs to breathe.
And despite technically all being separate to each other, each zooid cannot survive on its own.
And what an entity it is, being in some ways one of the biggest animals on Earth. Well, at least one of the longest. With the longest one ever found, stretching over 45 meters, meaning that it is longer than a blue whale, which is crazy to think about.
And yet, unlike a blue whale, it simply drifts through the dark in silent fashion, trailing its long...
And these tendrils or tentacles are filled with things called nematocysts, which is the same thing that jellyfish have.
And are used to sting and paralyze prey, which is exactly what the Praia Dubia uses them for as well, preying on things like...
But thankfully for us, submarine is not a part of its diet. And so, we move on.
As we get to the 1,000-meter mark, or 3,280 feet, we are now fully embraced by the bathypelagic zone, the midnight zone.
It's here in this perpetual night that we might encounter one of the ocean's most elusive phantoms. Stygiomedusa gigantea, aptly nicknamed the giant phantom jelly.
Deadliest. This massive jellyfish is almost mythic in its rarity. Since its discovery in 1899,
its bell, i.e. the head you could say, spans 1 meter across, which is impressive, but it's really its arms that are truly freakish.
Instead, favoring just 4 massive oral arms that stretch up to 10 meters in length, flowing behind it almost like a ghostly crimson curtain.
And without tentacles, they have no stingers. So you might be wondering, how does it feed then? And here's the really creepy part.
And that's pretty out there. But what's really shocking is that this seemingly delicate jellyfish-filled creature is...
But something that's even worse to run into, or rather swim into, is this. Forget everything you think you know about squid, as unlike the little guys towards the surface, which are made into calamari,
weighing up to 495 kilograms. And they're not just big, but also terrifying.
As its tentacles don't just have suckers, they have rotating, serrated hooks that function like biological, well, hooks. And these hooks will swivel and lock onto prey, ensuring that whatever the colossal squid grabs does not escape. And just to drive home how dangerously sharp these suckers are, no pun intended, take a look at this picture.
And if that's not scary enough, why don't you take a look at what it is looking at you with? And those right there.
Your eyes are probably only around 2.4 centimeters, so over 10 times smaller. But to come across these guys,
and that is Somniosus pacificus, i.e. the Pacific sleeper shark. Now, don't let this name fool you, because and not only is it a giant shark that prowls the depths for prey, it might actually be the giant shark, meaning
there was one sighting, which, while unconfirmed, did mention a sleeper shark that measured 9.2 meters or 30 feet long.
And while this guy, again, does not have submarine on its menu, who knows if it wouldn't try a little test bite. You would eventually hit 2,000 meters, or 6,561 feet. And if you look out the window,
but as you look for this totally real sign, you might instead be greeted by what looks like a giant prehistoric Anomalocaris.
Except this is no cockroach, but rather a giant isopod, which goes by the name Bathynomus giganteus.
Excellent. Now, if you've ever found pill bugs or roly-polies in your garden, well, congratulations, you've met the tiny cousins of...
But while your garden variety reaches maybe half an inch or so, these abyssal dwelling relatives grow to 50 centimeters long.
What makes these giant isopods remarkable isn't just their size, but their patience.
And I don't use the word suspended lightly. One specimen at Japan's Toba Aquarium went...
And another abyssal animal that also resembles a bug without actually being one is something that I am fully convinced came out of the movie Alien.
And despite their name, these aren't true spiders, but instead belong to an ancient lineage that diverged from the arthropod lineage.
The good news is that most sea spiders are tiny creatures, sometimes being as small as just 1 millimeter or 0.
But the truly bizarre aspect of this creature isn't just its size, but what happens inside. You see, it's...
And this is actually something that extends to all sea spiders. So in other words, imagine if your liver and intestines had suddenly...
But perhaps the one that can top it in terms of alienness is the creature found near hydrothermal vents at depths between 2,000 and...
These beings, which can grow to 2.4 meters or 7.9 feet, have evolved so dramatically that they've...
Instead, their body houses billions of bacteria in a specialized organ called the trophosome.
These microscopic partners convert hydrogen sulfide, a chemical so toxic that it would kill most animals instantly, into food.
And they do all of this in water hot enough to cook food thoroughly, and under pressure that would crush a human like an empty soda can.
But alas, our submersible journey is not complete until we've reached the most extreme depths.
Polychella gigantea. These oversized amphipods are distant relatives of the tiny beach hoppers you might see jumping around seaweed on a beach.
But while their surface cousins measure just a few millimeters, Alicella has evolved to reach lengths up to 34.
But with all that said, this does raise one important question. And that's why.
Why does a squid become half a ton, a roly-poly into a monster, and a worm into a human-sized tube?
Well, like most things in nature, there isn't a single answer, just a pile of rather compelling ones. Temperatures are our first suspect.
And this metabolic slowdown allows them to grow more slowly over much longer lifespans. So basically, instead of
And then food scarcity plays another crucial role, because the deep sea doesn't really have any convenient snacks drifting by every few minutes.
And so as a bigger animal, you can not only travel farther, but also hold more reserves, allowing you to outlast the famines.
And then just like the lack of food, there's also a lack of predators. And with fewer predators, animals can take their time.
And then the unlikeliest contributor is oxygen, which might seem odd as there's less oxygen in the deep ocean, and we
And so the idea is that a larger size is actually an adaptation to combat potential asphyxiation.
Individuals. For one, it might be for food storage, for others, lack of predation, and for others still, it might just be because the ocean.
However, the wildest part about all of this is that these are just some of the giants, as we have only just begun to look.
So with so little explored and discovered, you have to wonder, what else could be out there?